Hi guys, this is Ms. Howington here, and today we are going to talk about the deep ocean. So for the purposes of our class, we are going to consider the deep ocean below 4,000 meters. So like we talked about before, there's lots of different zones in the ocean, and they're broken up by depth and also the amount of light that penetrates that far. So below about uh, below about 200 meters, there starts to be not a whole lot of light, and then um, at about 1,000 meters or so, there stops being any light at all. Um, and we considered even further down when we talked about the open ocean. So we considered down to about 4,000 meters. So we're going to talk about the abyssal pelagic and the hydropelagic when we are talking about the deep ocean in this class. So keep in mind, we're lumping together a couple of zones here. So something that I've always found kind of mind-boggling is that 95% of the ocean, and especially the deep ocean, is unexplored. We've explored less of our ocean on Earth than we have of outer space. Well, that's kind of hard to quantify. We're going to go with the 95% of our ocean is unexplored. Outer space is very large and very difficult to quantify because multiverses and everything. All right, so down at below 4,000 meters deep is what we're going to consider the deep ocean. And so it's very expensive to explore because it's very dangerous to humans and it's very far away. So we need, so once you go down in the water pressure starts increasing. And once we get down to this area where we're talking about like the 4,000 meters and lower, the pressure will kill people. We also don't have the ability to hold our breaths to get down that far. And we have too much fat in our bodies and we wouldn't get down that far without assistance. So it's very dangerous to humans. And then the equipment that makes it possible for humans to get down that deep is very expensive and has to be really hardy and engineered very well. And it's also very time consuming, right? So, you have to spend the time to get out to the spot where it's that deep underneath you in the ocean, and then you have to spend the time to go down and collect things. So for that reason, the sampling methods that we've used to learn about the deep ocean have really only allowed us to survey a very small area, and then we kind of extrapolate from what we have learned from that small area and just make educated guesses about bigger areas. So we've started to learn a lot more as our technology has improved. It used to be that we literally like dropped strings with weights on them down to the bottom of the ocean to map the topography of the bottom of the ocean. We have a little bit more advanced technology now. So, as we've discussed with all of the other parts of the ocean, the patterns and the zones in the ocean, in the deep ocean. So one that's of note here is that it's pretty stable conditions in the deep ocean. So once you get down that far and there's that much water pressure sitting on top of the other water, there's not a ton of movement happening there. So it's pretty stable. The temperature stays right around -1 degree Celsius to -4 degrees Celsius. So it's actually below freezing. However, the pressure on top of it is so great that that water remains liquid at that temperature. The pH is about the pH of the ocean, so around 7.7 to 8. The salinity is about 3.35 parts per million. And the dissolved oxygen is really low and really constant. So remember that dissolved oxygen gets into the water either from dissolving directly from the air and down 4,000 meters below the surface of the ocean. Air is not interacting with that water, and also from photosynthesis, from organisms doing photosynthesis. And down at 4,000 meters, there's absolutely no sunlight, so there's no photosynthesis going on. So the dissolved oxygen down at this part of the ocean is really super low. You can see in this graph right here. We're talking about 4,000 meters, so that's here. So our dissolved oxygen levels are about, let's see, what is this? In the North Atlantic, our dissolved oxygen levels are around 250 micrograms and per liter, and in the North Pacific, it's around 100 micrograms per liter. So another thing to consider in the deep ocean is that there is a lot of pressure going on. So the rule of thumb is when you're diving or this is how pressure increases as you go down in the water column. For every 10 meters you go down in the water, it's like putting another weight of Earth's atmosphere on top of you. So sitting on the surface of the water, you have all of the weight of the air of Earth's atmosphere kind of like pushing down on you. And then you go down just 10 meters, and that's like adding another weight of Earth's atmosphere on top of you. So that's about 33 feet down. And so as you go down, that compresses all of the gases that are in your body. If you're a human, if you breathe air and you have gases floating around in your blood as well. And if you come up too quickly, and then those gases can form bubbles in your bloodstream, and that can travel to your brain and be very dangerous. So if you ever hear somebody talking about getting the bends, that's when divers come up too quickly and they haven't, and so a bubble of nitrogen usually has gotten too big too fast instead of slowly dissolving back into the blood. That's also why divers have to decompress. So after you dive down pretty deep and you stay there for a while, when you're coming back up, you have to pause for a little bit and wait every once in a while. So people can dive down to about 40 meters or so without any sort of protective gear on. It's going to get really cold, but a wetsuit should do fine. And then below that, you're going to start to need a hard protective suit because our bodies can't withstand that much pressure. But the important thing you need to know is that as you go down, the pressure increases. You add 1 atmosphere of pressure for every 10 meters you go down in the water. All right. So the surface, or the Earth's surface underneath the deep ocean is very, very variable. So it's just like the surface that we see up on the surface. That's great use of words there. It's like the topography that we see on the surface. And so the changes in the ocean floor result in different kind of microclimates underneath this in the deep sea on the ocean floor, just like it does on land. So different changes in topography, like we have different habitats for different animals that live in the mountains versus that live here in the Piedmont area with us, where it's a little bit flatter. The same thing happens on the floor of the ocean. That creates different ecological communities there. So as we've talked about with each different zone of the ocean that we've discussed, so organisms in the deep sea have some challenges that they face. And these are challenges compared to like us who are used to living on land. So they're not necessarily challenges per se to these organisms because they have adapted to these and that's what they're used to. So the one thing is that there's extremely high pressure. And so, things like swim bladders that fish that are up in the top of the pelagic zone and the epipelagic zone, that's not going to work out well for them because there's too much pressure squishing that down. And so their bodies of deep sea organisms really don't have a lot of extra space in them. So they've evolved so that they don't have body cavities that have like open space in them. So they don't have organs or space that can squish under really high pressure. So that's kind of interesting. Another challenge is the sediment. I don't know why there's not anything on this slide, but the sediment on the bottom of the deep ocean is really, really fine and really, really deep. So anything that has fallen down from the surface, which we call marine snow, has settled on the bottom of the ocean floor. And it's in the process of being compacted and turned into rock, but anything that has to do with geology takes a really long time. So the sediment is really, really fine muck, basically. And so organisms, if they're putting much pressure on it at all, they can actually sink in and get stuck there. And so organisms, to adapt and overcome that, they will have very spread out points of pressure. So if they are actually walking on the surface there, then they'll tend to have like really spindly legs, and each of their legs will tend to have like lots of little points of contact, so that their body weight is kind of spread out over a pretty large area that helps them from sinking. And then the other thing is they just don't rest on the ground. They swim instead. Another thing is that there's a really low density of food, right? So we talked about there being a low density of food in the pelagic zone, but in the pelagic zone, that includes even that top layer, that top 200 meters where there is sunlight and there are photosynthetic organisms. And we talked about how organisms in the pelagic zone are adapted to be really hydrodynamic, so they don't spend a lot of energy swimming. They can lower their metabolisms so that they can go a long time in between meals, and things like that. So even deeper down in the ocean, there is less energy available. So there's no sunlight, so there's no photosynthesis happening. So any energy that is coming into this system is falling down from the higher zones. So this is called a allochthonous system. So that means that almost all of the organic matter is coming from outside of the system. It's falling down from the deep, or from the zones of the ocean above it. So marine snow is particulate organic matter. So when small things break down as they die and decompose, or like maybe seaweed or something breaks down and decomposes, then that falls down in teeny tiny little particles. And it looks like snow in the light. It's not, it's organic matter. But they call it marine snow, and this is actually a source of food for a lot of organisms. And then another thing that can, another way that organic matter comes into the system is from falls. So if this could be a whale fall, or a, you can have a, I can't think of another example right now, but whale falls are the most common example that I can think of. So that means a whole body of a dead animal or a large part of a plant falls down into the deep sea, basically. And this is a huge source of food for organisms. So you can see here, there's a really big diversity of animals that are feeding off of this, and they use every single part. So after maybe the bigger sharks come in and they'll rip off the meat and the fat of the whales, then eventually like tiny worms come in and they will eat the bones of the whale as well. And then another adaptation that organisms have to deal with this really low density of food is that they can basically starve themselves and then gorge themselves. So when they find food, they will have the ability to eat a lot at once, or to gorge themselves. And then when there's not a lot of food, they are in a really cold environment, so it's very easy for them to slow down their metabolism, and so it can take them a long time to use that energy, and they're not burning through that energy really fast. Organisms in the deep sea also don't tend to be super fast or predatory, so they're not using a lot of energy. They're kind of moving a little bit slower to conserve that energy because they don't know where their next meal is coming from. An interesting thing that's seen pretty often in both polar oceans and in the deep sea is gigantism. And this is still kind of like up for debate as to why this happens. So you can see here, like this is a crab that was found. The giant squid lived down this deep. This is a giant isopod. And so these things get to be much, much larger than their warmer water counterparts. And so there's a couple of theories as to why they might get so big. So one thought is that maybe the cold water holds more oxygen because cold water can hold more dissolved oxygen than warm water can. So organisms have access to more oxygen and they can grow more that way. Another theory is that the cold temperature slows down their metabolism so that their temperatures aren't stressed as much. And so the aging process kind of slows down. And so they have the ability to live longer and get bigger. So, all right. So those are, that's your introduction to the deep sea. Yeah, and we will talk a little bit more about some of these things in depth in class. All right. Thanks, guys, for watching.